Yellowstone National Park is home to one of the most dangerous and awe-inspiring natural wonders in the world, a supervolcano. It's not just any volcano, it's a massive geological feature sitting quietly under the surface, with the potential to cause an event so catastrophic it could change life as we know it. This supervolcano has been dormant for thousands of years, but beneath the surface there's constant movement. Magma is churning, pressures are building, and every now and then, scientists see signs that something is brewing. While we don't know exactly when it will erupt, we know that it's still an active and volatile system, and experts warn that we are overdue for an eruption. If Yellowstone were to erupt tomorrow, the immediate effects would be so intense and destructive, it would feel like a disaster movie come to life. The eruption would likely begin with a massive earthquake as magma rises toward the surface, shaking the land and sending a tremor through the region. That earthquake would be followed by an eruption of unimaginable power. The skies would quickly darken as a massive ash cloud began to billow into the atmosphere. This cloud could stretch thousands of miles, covering much of the United States and beyond. The ash would block out sunlight, creating an eerie, apocalyptic atmosphere that would make it seem like day had turned to night. The ash fallout would have immediate and devastating consequences for the environment and human life. Cities like Denver, Salt Lake City, and even further parts of the country would be buried under layers of ash, disrupting air traffic, causing buildings to collapse under the weight, and making it incredibly dangerous to breathe. Respiratory problems would become widespread as fine ash particles filled the air, while the agriculture sector would face total destruction. Crops would be destroyed and livestock would perish, leading to food shortages and economic collapse. And at the same time, pyroclastic flows, which are fast-moving superheated gas and rock avalanches, would begin to flow out of the volcano at deadly speeds. These flows would travel for miles, scorching everything in their path. The heat would be so intense that it could melt the asphalt on roads, turning even the most ordinary routes into death traps for anyone trying to escape. As the flows move, toxic gases would be released into the air, further polluting the environment and making survival even more difficult. These pyroclastic flows would continue to spread, decimating the landscape and causing even more destruction. Imagine seeing an entire region being transformed into a hellish landscape, a world where everything is set on fire and nothing survives. The eruption's effects wouldn't be limited to just the areas surrounding Yellowstone. One of the most alarming impacts would be the potential for global cooling. The vast amount of ash and sulfuric gases released into the atmosphere would block out sunlight for months, or possibly even years. This could lead to what scientists call a volcanic winter. Temperatures around the world would plummet and the weather patterns would be completely disrupted. This global cooling would have a disastrous effect on crops, leading to widespread famine and food shortages. The Earth's climate would struggle to recover, and the ripple effects would be felt in nearly every country. The economic impact would be almost beyond comprehension. The global economy relies on trade, and with airports closed, roads destroyed, and communication lines down, the movement of goods would be severely disrupted, markets would crash, and countries would face severe financial strain. Many nations would find themselves unable to deal with the economic fallout, and some might even face bankruptcy. The agricultural collapse would be devastating not just in the United States, but around the world. The financial losses would be astronomical, and rebuilding would take decades, if not longer. This is the kind of destruction that scientists have been warning about for years. While it's not certain when or if this eruption will occur, it's clear that the supervolcano beneath Yellowstone remains active. And when it finally erupts, the consequences could be far-reaching and catastrophic. The world as we know it could be completely changed by a single event. This is why it's so important to understand what Yellowstone could do and to start thinking about how we can prepare for something that, though unlikely to happen tomorrow, is still a real and possible threat. Now that we understand just how destructive a Yellowstone eruption would be, let's dig deeper into the scientific side of it. What makes this supervolcano so dangerous, and why is it considered such a threat? To start, Yellowstone is not a single volcano, but a giant volcanic system that sits on top of a hotspot in the Earth's crust. This hotspot allows magma from deep within the Earth to rise toward the surface, and over millions of years, it has created what we now know as the Yellowstone caldera, which is essentially the largest active volcanic system in North America. The key to understanding the scale of a potential eruption lies in its geological history. Yellowstone has erupted 3 times in the past 2.1 million years, with each eruption being more powerful than the last. The most recent eruption occurred around 640,000 years ago, and it was so massive that it blanketed much of the western United States in ash. That eruption was what scientists refer to as a super eruption, capable of unleashing energy equivalent to thousands of atomic bombs going off at once. While the eruptions weren't constant, the caldera has shown ongoing signs of activity, and that's what makes Yellowstone so volatile. One of the most unsettling things about Yellowstone is that scientists have found evidence of continuous seismic activity, which means that the ground is constantly shifting. This ongoing ground deformation indicates that magma is still moving beneath the surface, causing pressure to build. The U.S. Geological Survey and other scientific organizations closely monitor these changes, watching for any signs of unusual volcanic activity. Despite this constant monitoring, however, we can't predict exactly when an eruption will occur. It could happen tomorrow, next year, or even 1,000 years from now, but what is certain is that Yellowstone is still active, and one day it could erupt once again. What would an eruption like this look like from a geological standpoint? The magma chamber beneath Yellowstone contains an enormous amount of magma, much more than typical volcanoes. If this magma were to rise rapidly to the surface, it would cause the ground to crack open. The immediate eruption would start with a violent explosion, sending a colossal amount of ash and gas into the air, potentially reaching altitudes that could affect the global atmosphere. At the same time, lava would pour from the caldera, creating rivers of molten rock that would flow for miles, scorching everything in their path. The sheer volume of material ejected during a Yellowstone eruption is mind-boggling. It's believed that the eruption could send hundreds of cubic kilometers of ash, lava, and volcanic gases into the atmosphere. To give you an idea of how massive this would be, a typical volcanic eruption releases a few million cubic meters of magma, but a Yellowstone super eruption could release more than 1,000 times that amount. This is what makes Yellowstone such a dangerous and unpredictable force in nature. The sheer scale of its potential eruption could dwarf anything we've ever seen in recorded history. In addition to the direct effects of an eruption, another issue would be the ongoing environmental changes that would follow. The ash alone would be enough to alter weather patterns for years. The global cooling effect, often referred to as volcanic winter, could cause temperatures to drop significantly, leading to frost and snow even in the middle of summer. This kind of climate change would lead to massive disruptions in the natural world. Ecosystems would be severely impacted, with plant and animal life struggling to survive in an altered environment. The global food supply would be in danger as crops would fail due to the lack of sunlight and sudden drops in temperature. This environmental shift would not only impact agriculture but also human health. The ash in the air would make it difficult to breathe, and the toxic gases like sulfur dioxide could cause widespread respiratory problems. Even if people managed to escape the immediate impact zone, the effects of the eruption would continue to affect them no matter where they went. These gases could cause acid rain, poisoning bodies of water, and further destroying the landscape. Yellowstone's eruption would also put major stress on the global economy. Countries would face immense financial difficulties as they tried to deal with the aftermath. The eruption would likely take out entire regions of infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and electrical grids. This would make it impossible for many areas to function normally. Airports would be shut down, making it nearly impossible to fly anywhere. Cities would be cut off, and it would be difficult to deliver aid to affected areas. Global supply chains would collapse, and businesses would struggle to recover, leading to widespread economic hardship. This kind of catastrophic event could take years to recover from, and some areas might never fully return to normal. The risks associated with Yellowstone are not just theoretical. They are very real, and it's something we must prepare for. While scientists continue to monitor the area, there's no way to predict exactly when the eruption might occur. What we do know is that the signs are there, and we need to be aware of what could happen if that time comes. Being prepared means understanding the scale of the threat, the environmental impact, and the potential consequences of such a devastating event. As we continue to explore the potential effects of a Yellowstone eruption, it's important to focus on the immediate aftermath and the challenges humanity would face in the wake of such an event. What happens after the eruption? What would the world look like, and how would society respond to this unprecedented disaster? First, we need to understand how the landscape itself would be transformed. The eruption would be so catastrophic that the area around Yellowstone would be left nearly unrecognizable. A massive crater would form where the caldera used to be, and the ground itself would collapse, creating a huge depression in the Earth's crust. This massive void would change the geography of the region, and rivers, lakes, and forests would be forever altered. The eruption would not just affect Yellowstone National Park, it would change the entire surrounding area, possibly affecting as much as half of the United States. One of the most immediate threats would be the ash fallout. This ash would blanket the landscape for hundreds of miles, severely impacting infrastructure and making everyday life nearly impossible. Imagine entire cities buried under inches or even feet of ash. Roads would be impassable, and buildings would collapse under the weight. Ash would clog machinery, including cars and aircraft, making transportation nearly impossible. It would even be dangerous to breathe, as the fine particles would cause severe respiratory issues for anyone caught in the fallout. For those who survived the initial explosion, they would now be facing an environment that is toxic and suffocating. One of the greatest challenges would be the massive number of displaced people. Cities and towns across the affected regions would be evacuated, as the ash would make it impossible to live or work in those areas. This could lead to a mass exodus, with millions of people trying to find safety in other regions. However, with transportation systems destroyed and the roads blocked, movement would be extremely difficult. Temporary shelters would be set up in less affected areas, but these would quickly become overwhelmed, leading to overcrowded conditions and shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. Humanitarian aid would be essential, but getting help to those who need it would be incredibly challenging due to the disrupted infrastructure. The economic impact of the eruption would also be catastrophic. Trade routes, both domestic and international, would be completely disrupted. The ash cloud would block out sunlight, causing crop failures around the world. This would lead to widespread food shortages, especially in countries that rely on American exports. Global economies would be plunged into turmoil, and many countries could face a complete collapse. The damage to the environment, infrastructure, and economy would take years, even decades, to recover from. The climate would change dramatically as well. With the massive amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide released into the atmosphere, a phenomenon known as volcanic winter would take hold. This would cause temperatures to drop significantly around the world. For a time, the Earth's climate could cool by several degrees, which would have devastating consequences for agriculture. Short growing seasons, colder temperatures, and altered precipitation patterns would cause crop failures and make it harder to produce enough food to feed the global population. The cooling effect could last for months or even years, making it difficult for humans to adapt and survive. As the world deals with these dramatic environmental and societal changes, governments and organizations would be scrambling to respond. Emergency services would be overwhelmed, and it's uncertain whether they would be able to reach all affected areas. Even if rescue and relief efforts were successful in some regions, many areas would be left to fend for themselves. In some places, emergency crews might be unable to reach those in need due to blocked roads, destroyed buildings, or hazardous conditions. The sheer scale of the eruption would make it incredibly difficult to mount an organized response, and without communication lines, coordination would be nearly impossible. In the wake of such destruction, society would have to adjust to a new normal. With the economy shattered and the environment severely impacted, life as we know it would fundamentally change. The social fabric would be tested as people scramble to survive, and communities would need to come together to rebuild what was lost. Governments would face enormous challenges in managing the recovery process. Resources would be scarce, and the long-term environmental damage could affect generations to come. What's clear is that the eruption of Yellowstone would not just be a natural disaster, it would be a global crisis that would reshape the course of human history. What would be the psychological and emotional toll on people? It's hard to imagine the level of trauma that would follow such an event. The loss of loved ones, homes, and entire communities would be heartbreaking. People would be forced to confront not only the immediate devastation, but also the long-term effects of living in a world drastically changed. The constant uncertainty about when or if life will ever return to normal would create widespread anxiety and stress. It's difficult to say how people would cope with the aftermath of something so overwhelming, but the survival instinct would likely push many to keep going. Even in the face of the most dire circumstances, the aftermath of a Yellowstone eruption would be far more than just a natural disaster. It would be an event of such immense scale that it would challenge the very survival of humanity. From the immediate environmental destruction to the long-term societal and economic consequences, the world would be irrevocably changed. As we reach the final part of this exploration into the hypothetical eruption of Yellowstone, it's important to reflect on how the world might eventually recover. Although the scale of the disaster would be unprecedented, humanity has always shown remarkable resilience in the face of catastrophe. In this part, we'll look at the potential paths to recovery and what steps would need to be taken to adapt to a drastically changed world. And one of the most pressing challenges would be rebuilding the global infrastructure. After the eruption, communication systems would be down, electricity grids would be destroyed, and many roads would be impassable due to ash, lava, and the collapse of structures. The immediate aftermath would be chaotic, with governments and organizations trying to re-establish order and get aid to the people who need it most. While recovery would be slow, it's possible that technological advancements could help speed up the process. In the years following the eruption, nations might work together to rebuild their infrastructures, focusing on alternative energy sources and more resilient designs for homes and cities. The goal would be to create a more sustainable and adaptable society that could withstand future natural disasters. The environmental recovery would be just as crucial but far more difficult. The volcanic winter caused by the eruption would cause crops to fail globally, leading to food shortages. In the months and years following the eruption, scientists would be studying the effects on the atmosphere, climate, and ecosystems. It's likely that agriculture would need to be radically transformed. Traditional farming methods might be replaced with new techniques that are more resistant to the harsh conditions created by the eruption. Vertical farming, genetically modified crops, and innovations in food production could become critical to feeding a world that is struggling with crop failures. Additionally, efforts to restore ecosystems damaged by ash and pyroclastic flows would be essential, but the recovery of forests, rivers, and wildlife could take decades, even centuries. Another area that would need significant attention is the psychological impact of such a disaster. The eruption of Yellowstone would not just be a physical disaster, but a psychological one as well. People around the world would be dealing with grief, trauma, and fear, as entire communities and cultures might be wiped out. In the aftermath, mental health support would be essential to help individuals and families cope with the emotional toll of the disaster. The loss of homes, loved ones, and the familiar world would require extensive counseling, therapy, and community rebuilding. Over time, people would need to find hope and purpose in the midst of devastation, and mental health organizations would be on the front lines, helping people adjust to the new reality. The global economy would eventually need to stabilize as well, although this would take time. The eruption would disrupt global trade, cause widespread unemployment, and leave economies in ruins. But history has shown that economies can recover, albeit slowly. A focus on sustainable development and rebuilding industries would be key to long-term recovery. New markets would likely emerge, such as those focused on clean energy and technologies to mitigate future disasters. Countries that are able to adapt to the new environmental conditions and work together in rebuilding global supply chains may be able to bounce back more quickly. However, the global community would need to reimagine the way we operate as a species, moving away from reliance on fossil fuels, for example, and focus on creating systems that can withstand future challenges. In the face of all these challenges, one of the greatest opportunities for recovery would lie in international cooperation. The eruption of Yellowstone would affect the entire globe, and no single nation would be able to recover alone. In fact, the scale of the disaster would make global cooperation essential. Countries would need to share resources, information, and expertise to rebuild and adapt to the new environmental realities. While the eruption could strain international relationships, it could also serve as a wake-up call, pushing nations to collaborate in ways they never have before. Together, we would have to tackle the issue of climate change head-on, learn from past mistakes, and build a future that is more resilient to natural disasters. As humanity slowly adapts to life in a post-Yellowstone world, one thing would be certain: the eruption would leave an indelible mark on our collective consciousness. We would likely come to view the world differently, more fragile, more interconnected, and more in need of careful stewardship. The disaster would remind us of how vulnerable we are to the forces of nature, but also of our incredible ability to rebuild and rise from the ashes. In the end, the recovery from a Yellowstone eruption would be one of the greatest challenges humanity has ever faced. It would test our survival instincts, our ability to adapt, and our willingness to come together as a global community. The consequences of such an event would ripple through history for generations to come, but with perseverance and innovation, life could eventually return to something resembling normalcy. What's clear is that the world would never be the same again, and humanity would have to learn from this catastrophic event to build a more sustainable, resilient future for ourselves and future generations. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild journey into the world of Yellowstone and what would happen if it erupted tomorrow. I hope this scenario has sparked your curiosity about the potential impacts of natural disasters. Let me know in the comments how you would prepare for such an event. And as always, don't forget to check out my other videos on natural disasters and emergency preparedness. You never know what might be next.